Welcome to this important session as part of the Daring Cities Congress 2020. The title of our session today is Continuing the Learning, Leaving a Legacy of Partnerships at the Local Level. My name is Megan Spires. I represent ICLEI Africa in today's webinar, and we're very privileged to have a strong panel with us of scientists, of experts, and of practitioners. They're going to speak about their journey and experience in implementing particularly climate change adaptation projects on the ground globally, but also particularly in African cities, and what have been their lessons and experiences in terms of leaving a legacy on the ground and ensuring that projects don't begin and end, and that there are legacy elements left behind for our cities, which is so essential. So the discussion today is really around how do we, as organizations working at the city scale, ensure, despite the fact that there are specific funding cycles with specific resources that increase and decrease over time, that we are leaving a long-term legacy in our cities, and that really is the focus. ICLEI as a city network has always had the mantra and approach that we do not leave our cities, that we are in it for the long haul, and that's why being a membership-based organization is so important. But of course, we recognize the challenge that funding does come in tranches, and we have this specific window of opportunity to use that to leave sustainability within the cities in which we work. I want to first of all encourage all participants that have joined us today, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us, to please send through your questions using the chat function. We'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. So send your questions as they come to you, send your comments, we welcome them, and we would love to have participation. At the end of our inputs from our panelists, we'll be posing these questions to them, and we really want to encourage that. So how today's webinar will work is that we will receive 2 inputs, and then we'll have some questions posed that have been pre-prepared to our panelists, and we will then open the floor and also harness the questions as they've come in during the session. Our first panelist, who we'll hear from first, is Dr. Tony Sochi, and Tony is the Senior Lead for International Resilience and Adaptation Policy at the US EPA. And he will share some reflections on a particularly innovative initiative called EPIC-N, and Tony will give more about that soon, and share some of the progress that EPIC-N has been making globally, and also particularly in Africa, which is the continent where I am from. After Tony, we'll have an input from Liz Mullen-Bernhard. She is the coordinator of the Global Adaptation Network at UNEP, and she will share some of the impressive work that the Global Adaptation Network is doing in implementing tangible adaptation actions across the globe. Thereafter, our 3 panelists include Dr. Mzime Indebele Marissa, and Mzime is a program specialist at START. Then we have Dr. Gilbert Siame, and he is the director of the Center for Urban Research and Planning at the University of Lusaka. And lastly, we have Dr. Chris Jack, who is the Deputy Director of the Climate Systems Analysis Group at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And these 3 latter panelists I know particularly well. We've been working together over the last 5 years on a program called Future Climate Resilience for African Cities and Lands, otherwise known as FRACTAL, and I've had many lessons that we can share in terms of how we bridge the divide between science and practice. FRACTAL at its core is a transdisciplinary project, so we spend lots of time thinking about third space learning. We spend lots of time bringing together different disciplines and different sectors and ways of thinking, practitioners and scientists into the same space, and unpacking what it means to be these practitioners with their own discourses and worldviews. We deal with issues like power dynamics and how to ensure that all stakeholders are able to contribute very tangibly in developing climate change information, climate change knowledge that is science-based, but also highly relevant to use in African cities. So this particular project has been working in 9 Southern African cities since 2015. So it's been a long-term project. There have been many learnings, and the core tenet has been, how do we advance scientific knowledge on climate change, and how is that knowledge useful to city practitioners? So we really do look forward to the reflections on that particular program a bit later on in our panel discussion. So without further ado then, I'll hand over to Tony. Many of us who will join the session will know Tony well. He's been a long-term advocate for climate change work and climate change adaptation work, and we're very privileged to have you with us, Tony. Over to you.
Thank you, Megan, and it's great to be here, and thanks everybody for being part of the webinar today. So my role today is to talk a little bit about the EPIC model, which my institution, the US EPA, played a role in with many other institutions in trying to introduce to Africa and now Southeast Asia as well, and hopefully many other countries over time. So starting at the beginning, I guess, is where we should pick up. EPIC stands for Educational Partnerships for Innovation in Communities, and that's the acronym. And these partnerships make available to governments and communities the largely untapped resources, the creativity, expertise, and know-how that's concentrated in universities. But this partnership, this EPIC model partnership, basically tries to help cities tackle real issues of local concern and to bring that expertise in the universities to bear on the problems at hand. EPIC also greatly enhances a city's capacity and a community's capacity to develop more sustainably, build resilience, and adapt. And in that regard, it's very similar to the FRACTAL program, but departs in other ways as well. So I regard the EPIC model as really simple in its inception. It's amazingly simple in its inception, yet despite that, it's highly effective in application. On the ground, you can use it to do fairly amazing things. Students tend to be the cornerstone of the EPIC model partnership, that local issues defined by local governments and communities are woven into existing classes and coursework under faculty supervision as projects or issues presented to them are in search of a resolution. So that's basically how the process works. Students are at the heart of this thing. So it's also, the model is highly adaptable to different administrative structures, universities, NGOs, local governments, geography, social norms, cultures, and contexts, as we now see the model taking hold in African cities. So as for the origin of the model and the growth, it originated way back in 2009 at the University of Oregon. And now, I don't know, over a decade later, there are about 57 universities worldwide that are implementing the model, that have adopted it. There have been over 1,400 projects completed in that time, and in over 250 cities worldwide to date. The EPIC network continues to grow. That is the network of all of the implementing cities. And we began to, back in 2017, we started to think, well, we reflected, and the EPIC model had never really left the United States in any significant way. So we decided to host a training on the EPIC model in Germany in 2017 and invite people from around the world, cities and universities. The response was overwhelming. That was the first EPIC training outside of the US on the model. And then we followed that later in 2017 with a regional scale training for Southern African cities, which we hosted in Cape Town. That event led to the formation of what we now call the EPIC Africa Network. And several African cities have now been using the model to do a variety of projects, bringing students into this process as well. So back in 2020, in February of this year, EPIC Africa organizers also organized the first training workshop led by Africans for Africans to expand the EPIC network in Africa. And that was very successful. We're now, the EPIC partners are now trying to bring the EPIC model to Southeast Asia by way of a training next year. early March of 2021. So my concluding remarks are as follows. It seems from every way you look at this that the EPIC model is innovative and transformative. And because it makes available to local governments and community the full breadth of the intellectual resources within a university. It's not just climate, it could be engineering, any form of engineering, communication, sociology, whatever is there is ideally amenable to being part of the community, part of the response to the community's needs. The EPIC partner also taps into the creativity of students. They get a chance to sort of start taking on real life issues in a safe, effective, and structured way. The university also becomes better integrated into communities because we've heard for a long time now how divorced universities often seem to be from their communities. Well, this pulls them in a very significant way, and so that they become responsive to the community and its needs and issues. Many students go on from this experience and become civil servants for local governments. The EPIC projects that people do using this model tend to reflect the whole gamut of the Sustainable Development Goals, everything you can imagine, cities in particular. And what's more than that, the EPIC model adopters tend to organize themselves into independent yet connected regional networks, such as EPIC Africa. And it represents a dynamic, growing international network of locally organized and locally led regional networks. In other words, it has sustainability. And as long as cities have issues and communities have issues to deal with, and I don't know of any city in the world I've ever been to that didn't have more issues than it could handle. So there's a long road ahead, and this model could be very important in trying to tackle that and trying to sort of bring communities and universities and local governments together. And with that, I think I will stop and pass it over to the next speaker, which I guess is Liz Bernhardt.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony. That was so useful. And of course, our experiences as ICLEI in terms of these types of partnerships that bring universities and local governments together in really tangible ways to play to their strengths. So city officials and politicians need answers to questions, and researchers need questions to answer. And I think it's meeting a real need within cities. So now I'm going to hand over to Liz Mullen-Bernhardt. She has a few slides that are now on the screen. So Liz, over to you, and we so look forward to hearing about your work.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you, Tony, for that great overview of EPIC. Hi to everyone who's in this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to speak with you today. And I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I look forward to this discussion. My name is Liz Mullen-Bernhardt. I'm the coordinator of the Global Adaptation Network, which is hosted by the UN Environment Program, UNEP, in our beautiful headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'd like to tell you a bit about our work in climate change adaptation, how we work globally, and also our history and our particular interest in partnerships like EPIC. So I have a few slides I'd like to use just to show you and give you that overview. If we could skip to the next one, that'd be great. Thank you. So UNEP is part of the UN Secretariat. It's part of the UN system. We're one of the only ones that's actually located in the global south, by the way, which makes us a lot closer, I think, to the issues that the UN should be working on. It also has challenges, being outside of some of the other headquarter positions, but we do operate globally. So although we are based in Kenya, but we work worldwide. We have a mandate to help countries address a whole range of environmental issues, and one of them is certainly climate change. That includes both mitigation and adaptation efforts. And certainly in the past few years, in particular the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a huge interest and increase in support and our own mandate to help countries with climate change adaptation in particular. Now, UNEP being the environment program, our very particular interest is in nature-based solutions for adaptation, or what we call ecosystem-based adaptation. But that's not all that we do. We have a whole range of projects, and this map on the page shows you some information about our portfolio. But we have more than $250 million in projects running around the world that run through the office that I'm in. And that's through Global Environment Fund, Adaptation Fund, and Green Climate Fund primarily. But we also have bilateral projects as well. These are in more than almost 60 countries now worldwide. Almost 60 projects in 30 countries worldwide, and they cover a whole range of ecosystem-based adaptation or adaptation issues in general. And primarily, we work in the areas of land restoration, climate-resilient agriculture, forest rehabilitation, and we do this in all sorts of different kinds of ecosystems, from coastal to wetlands to drylands to mountains. We also support countries in their national adaptation planning. The overview you see here is over the past few years, but most of these projects, in fact, have come online within the last 2 or 3 years. So really, this portfolio has exploded quite a lot in the very recent past, which means that we're still in the middle of quite a number of these projects and don't yet have results or the outcomes from them. But I would like to tell you, give you an example of one project that is in a city in Africa. If you could skip to the next slide. To give you an example of some of the things that we do. Now, this project is really interesting. It ended, in fact, last year. It's in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And in fact, there were 2 sister projects that were implemented together. And that's because of the different funding sources that were part of this project in the Adaptation Fund and the LDCs Fund. But the issue that was identified outside of Dar is rising sea levels, which are expected to be from half a foot to 1.5 foot up until 2050, which is projected to cost the city at least $200 million a year by that time, including $5.3 billion that could be affected in public and private assets, which would be at risk from flooding, from sea level rise. And compounding that fact is the degradation of habitats, in particular coral reefs and mangroves. So what these 2 sister projects did was both a gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. So it built city walls along the coast at the same time as it also rehabilitated the habitats that were mentioned. And the results of the project were such that sea walls were built and upgraded. Aquifers also were relocated in order to prevent their contamination from sea level rise. Integrated coastal zone management strategies were implemented, and the project restored 3,000 square meters of coral reefs and 1,000 hectares of mangrove forests, both of which can stop the impacts of waves and flooding at the coast. Now, in a typical project in the UN system, right, our counterpart naturally is national governments, right? As the UN works with countries to get adaptation plans into place, right? And we're extremely much funding driven, right? So we have a donor or a country that expresses a certain priority, and we have funding for that purpose, and we create a project, and we set it up, we implement that project, and then the project finishes, and then it's over. And we have the problem again and again with what happens after that project ends. There's often not additional funding to keep it going or to establish much of sustainability for those projects that we have. This project in Dar is a bit different. I think we handled it in a better way. What we did there was work with the district councils around Dar and the Dar City Council as well. And this project established and trained community groups, self-governing community groups. It established 87 different groups and transferred the assets that were created. So the seawalls and particularly the mangroves, they were then handed over into the hands of the community groups to keep them maintained. And so this project really made an effort to involve local city councils and involve the city level as much as possible, as well as create those community groups that could keep it going. This is the kind of thing that I think UN projects need to do in general. And this is exactly the kind of interface where I feel that working with a network like EPIC or a project like FRACTAL could help take on from where we've worked, right? And make this more sustainable. Even better, certainly, is if we could be involved in co-designing that project from the very, very beginning. But I see a lot of potential for collaboration and dovetailing with the mandates that we have and the kind of work that we can do. If I could just show the last slide, just to give you a little bit of an overview. So in order to share this information about not only the portfolio of projects like this one that UNEP has, and what knowledge has been gained and what lessons are learned, and how to share that with others, and how to make them that more sustainable. It's not just, of course, UNEP's own projects, but there are many other adaptation projects around the world. And precisely for that reason is why we created the Global Adaptation Network. So GAN was created around the same time as EPIC. We started in 2010 with the express idea of sharing information and knowledge and building that capacity around adaptation. And we do that in a number of ways. We have a very active listserv. We work through our series of regional adaptation networks and nodes, which you can see here on this map. And each of those is hosted by one of UNEP's regional offices, for example, in Latin America, in West Asia, in Africa, which is in Nairobi, and also in Asia Pacific, which is in Bangkok. And so we work through these regional nodes in order to gather information and help share that information at a regional level, because we believe that adaptation and information and knowledge sharing should happen as locally as possible. And regional level is about as local as UNEP gets. We don't have many country offices. We're not a big organization like some of the others that have a lot more country presence. But I do believe that culturally, linguistically, geographically, that information is probably best shared among people who live as close to each other as possible. But we also have a number of partnerships that we work through, and one of them is together with UNFCCC. We contribute directly to the Nairobi Work Program through something we call the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative, the LAKI. And the one that I think is really, personally for me, most exciting is the EPIC initiative. And although EPIC and GAN have almost the same birthday, they didn't really meet each other until a few years ago. And I believe it was at that famous Bonn event that Tony was mentioning in 2017. But we certainly see a tremendous value in sharing what we can do globally, that global mandate that we have, a global expertise and the ability to feed into international processes and have a certain kind of, I don't know, convening power or mandate that we have at the UN. We see a tremendous possibility of working with organizations that are as sustainable as possible. And by sustainable, what I mean really is self-sustaining. And one thing I really love about the EPIC model is that it is extremely adaptable. As Tony mentioned, it matches local expertise with local needs. And I think nobody knows better what is needed at a local level than people who live at that local level. So I think it really matches quite well with what we can do. And so we're really happy to be working with EPIC and supporting EPIC in whatever way we can. And one of my first the pleasure I had of one of my first tasks in this role was actually to learn about EPIC and to attend the network meeting of EPIC Africa in Durban earlier this year in February. And so we're really excited to see EPIC Africa, to support that how we can, and also to see EPIC grow in other regions where it makes sense organically to do so. And for that, certainly we need the right kinds of champions and the right kind of local talent that's involved. In terms of other future hopes or dreams that I would have for EPIC, within the GAN Secretariat, we are hiring a series of regional liaisons that will be supporting different regions. One of them is for Africa. When we have that person on board, hopefully within the next few weeks, I'd really like that person to help connect some of the EPIC Africa with some of the other adaptation and similar initiatives that might be happening around Africa to create more of a synergy and a node around Africa. So we're really keen to see initiatives like this work, and it's a pleasure for me to open up to answer any questions you might have and to continue the discussion. So I'll end there and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's so wonderful to hear about the work that GAN is doing, particularly in the adaptation finance space. As many of us know that work in the climate finance space, we know of the challenges of adaptation finance, but also equally, if not more importantly, the importance of adaptation finance, particularly in the African context. So it is wonderful to hear that that's been prioritized, and I could ask questions around how we deal with the need for that to flow to cities. You spoke about national governments, etc., but I won't ask that question. I'm going to pose a question actually to Mzime. Mzime, if you could just reflect, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest barriers and opportunities to continue the learning during and post-project implementation? We know your involvement in FRACTAL, we know your multiple other engagements as part of your start role. So you've had a lot of experience being involved in projects that have start and end dates. And what have you done and what is START's experience and how you leave that lasting legacy in the cities that you work?
Thank you so much, Megan, and thanks to Tony and Liz for that very comprehensive overview on EPIC. As Megan mentioned, my organization, START International, has been involved, fortunately, in both the FRACTAL and the EPIC work, and in partnership with organizations represented here, as well as others. So to speak to your question, Megan, what I've done is I have categorized, or I've summarized the barriers and opportunities into 3 categories. And what I will do is I will talk about the barriers, but at the same time also talk about the opportunities for each of the barriers. So starting off with the first barrier, which I have called, or rather is this issue of fast personnel turnover, particularly when it comes to local governments and especially the politicians, but sometimes it also happens even with technical staff or officers who have at most maybe 3 years in office. So the question always is, how do you continue the learning beyond that fast turnover? And I will talk about the opportunities that we have used in partnership with others in FRACTAL, for example. It's this pushing or shifting away from awareness campaigns and awareness raising only, and beginning this process of the iterative capacity building, and started a lot of experience, over 20 years experience in capacity building in developing regions such as Africa and Asia. And this really is a process of growing a network of very informed, committed, connected people, working on various aspects of understanding and addressing issues such as climate change, and also building resilience, as well as problems and intervention. And what it does is, in building or designing such capacity building support, it's beyond the office, such that it becomes institutionalized. And these very processes transcend the office, and they can continue as lessons that are embedded within the culture of the institutions that we are dealing with. I think Tony, as well as Elizabeth, talked about partnerships. So together with other partners, we have been able to offer such capacity building processes that continue. So the lessons that come from there, the interventions that come from there, and the impacts that come from that capacity building sort of approach or or processes continue on beyond an office, beyond a post. And then the second one that I'll talk about as a barrier or a complexity is really this issue of collaborating or working with partners, which has been mentioned before. Because often you'll find that the issues that are faced in our cities and communities are very complex. So therefore, there's a need to then approach them in using interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches that transcend these siloed approaches. So working as a team in these often very large partnerships, and also dealing with different forms of knowledge, different diverse partners that come with their own agendas and issues, if I may say, and the different stakeholders. For instance, with EPIC, you are talking about the university, academia, and research. You're also talking about the local government who have their own way of working or looking at things. The students themselves, which are a different sort of a partner or stakeholder, and the communities. So you'll find that it becomes so complex to try and work towards a common vision or a common solution when you are working with such complexity. However, and maybe if I may also add on to that point, that one of the barriers, and this often comes up, I mean, in almost every EPIC training, there's always this issue of resources, and most people will point out financial resources as being a barrier to try and make sure that whatever legacy is being pushed continues. And time also can be a constraint, but even the technical expertise or the training, impactful training itself, it takes time, it takes effort for it to be embedded or for it to continue post such programs as FRACTAL or EPIC. But I'll also speak of an opportunity there in that the programs such as EPIC and FRACTAL, even though they take time and even though they take different forms of resources, they really are worthwhile in terms of being a sustained effort, because it's about building relationships, building partnerships, building trust, building working systems. So I know there's a question that's going to be addressing this issue of how important it is to build relationship, but it really is an opportunity through the EPIC model, through the FRACTAL approach, to build such relationships that last. And again, it speaks to my last point about lasting beyond an office and so forth and so on. Another opportunity in this kind of barrier opportunity tandem is this opportunity to find champions. And this language is something that is very common with FRACTAL as well as EPIC, in that, you know, it helps to find champions within each group of partners who then champion the cause of whatever it is that is the common goal that is being worked towards. And in this particular case, we're looking at climate change related issues, building resilience, and so forth. And you'll find that those champions become the effort towards the sustainability. They are the ones who will take forth the agenda within their institutions and so forth and so on. So that's an opportunity in itself, to be able to build those long-term relationships through champions, through sustained relationships. And these relationships often last beyond the project. I'm sure Gilbert and Chris will talk about these relationships and how they have taken on other work beyond the FRACTAL project, for instance, in their cities and in their own work. But I think in that point, we're trying to say there's a chance to bring together multiple or parallel processes and collaboratively work together towards one vision, despite the barrier of resources. And then my last point, when it comes to barriers, the third one, I've called it context. And this can be a limitation in that if one or a group or a team does not, first of all, understand or take the time and the effort to study the context in which they are working, then sometimes achieving the sustainability or the long-term legacy, particularly in learning, becomes futile. So it's very important to make an effort to take time to understand the context, because a lot of the issues that we are trying to address are not only wicked complex issues, but they are very context specific, and their solutions are often driven by specific context. And it speaks to the EPIC model in that you are trying to work with local communities to bring local solutions. And this really embodies this idea of having a bottom-up approach, of working with, and also for it to be truly participatory in terms of the partnerships that come on board. So the barriers in context include such things such as attitude, perceptions, norms and behaviors, even decision-making processes. This was very big in FRACTAL, in that, you know, we really took time to try and understand what are the decision-making processes, what underpins those decision-making processes, mapping, for example, the power dynamics, the politics, understanding things such as red tape and bureaucracy, because it then made sure that our efforts were directed effectively. And again, this speaks to this issue of how we can then sustain the efforts beyond the projects or beyond personalities. So the opportunity there is in understanding the context and studying the context and working with the context, means that you then are able to engage the partners and the different stakeholders well. You also are able to bring out things like voice equity. And in FRACTAL, this was very important and emphasized, that we would come into this third space, as Megan called it, where the different forms of knowledge that were being brought to the table, there was no superior knowledge, but we understood and appreciated that there were different forms of knowledge, and that if we bring them all together, we are more likely to be able to engage more and to bring collaborative solutions. So in closing, I will say that even though not understanding context can be a barrier to having sustained or long-term or lifelong learning, you can also turn it into an opportunity by taking the time and the effort to understand the context. And I'll close with this statement that it's really all about working with rather than working for communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mzime. Very inspirational words. I found resonating a lot with what you said. So 2 things I want to say is, 1, participants, please share questions and comments in the chat box. We'd love to pose those to the panelists a bit later on. And then 2, if our panelists don't mind all sharing their videos now, we'd just like to see you all and be able to engage in a little bit more of an interactive fashion. So if you can just do that. And then I want to actually go to Chris. I want to build on what Mzime was saying in terms of relationships, because that was the question we were going to pose to you, Chris, about some of the innovative tools and methods that FRACTAL has pioneered over the last 5 years. And many of them have centered around this central issue of relationships and trust-based relationships. So some thoughts from you, Chris, please.
Great, thanks, Megan. And thanks, Mzime, for an excellent introduction to all that I'm about to say. You've covered a lot of points and it's been really valuable. So yes, there's a lot to talk about relationships. For us, it's really emerged as a kind of core element of FRACTAL. I'll start off actually by saying I'm a climate scientist. My background is computer models and working with numbers and data. And that's where I came from over the last 20 years. So for me to be talking about relationships as the most important thing in a project is quite a transition. And I think that kind of transition reflects something that we need to be looking for, transitions in other contexts. So just some of my background, because I think that's quite important. I think what I'd like to start off by saying is we kind of assume that relationships just happen. We kind of assume that we get people together in a project, and we have some meetings and we sit in a room together and discuss things and come up with plans and even these ideas of co-production co-producing knowledge, we just kind of assume that the relationships will happen. But for a whole lot of reasons, there's a lot of barriers to real trust relationships developing. And I've been involved in a lot of projects over the years where you make this assumption that there are good relationships, and then something goes wrong and you suddenly realize actually there isn't trust here and there aren't really good relationships. So they don't just happen. It takes effort. It takes a lot of time. So FRACTAL's around for 4 years. We're now into a 5th year. And you would think that's a long time, but actually it takes that long to build these kind of relationships. So a message back to funding, and also even to stuff that's already been spoken about today, is the long-term engagement that's required to build this kind of sustainability. And we need to think about how that works in these funding cycles. So they don't just happen. They do require really thoughtful, intentional approaches. Relationships are challenging for a lot of reasons. I'll start by talking about relationships across disciplines. That's been a really key learning area of FRACTAL. I'll give you, again, I think personal reflections are quite useful. For myself, working in FRACTAL, really worked in depth with social scientists. And I know there's a whole spectrum of social scientists, but with some quite, what I would call quite extreme social science, where you actually have a completely different way of thinking about problems and what is objective reality and truth. And these are real challenges to working together. And I know other natural scientists involved in the project found that almost impossible to overcome these kind of barriers across disciplines. So that some of the approaches we took to working across disciplines is trying to keep it fairly informal. So we tend to try and engage across disciplines by all standing up and presenting our work from our disciplinary perspective. And a lot of the time that doesn't achieve very much. So we tried to create informal spaces. And one of the most marked ones we did in FRACTAL was, after a day working in a sort of workshop context, we were all sitting in a really nice place just off the Kafue River in Zambia. And we had a fire and we were eating dinner. And we decided, let's just get our laptops out and show each other what we do. What does it actually look like when me as a climate science produces some climate information? What do I actually do? And I have people looking over my shoulder. And we had a hydrologist or hydrological engineer there. And she showed us exactly what does it actually look like. And it diminished the sort of aura and the impenetrability of these disciplines that we think we'll never be able to understand what that person does. So these kind of informal interactions are really, really important. We also spend a lot of time, in fact, just this morning we ran a session in Gaborone and with some policy makers, and we did a session there again looking at terminology. We use words so freely within our disciplines, and not even within our disciplines, outside of disciplines. So when I use the word like resilience, what does that mean to a city councillor in Lusaka? What does that mean to a social scientist? What does that mean to me as a natural scientist? And we spend a lot of time looking at what do these words actually mean. And even coming from that, you come to ways of framing problems and ways of thinking about things. So we put a lot of time into that. And it doesn't always feel like really useful time, because you're not looking at climate projections, you're not looking at maps and data, you're just talking about words. But what we realize is that it really brings a lot of benefit in the long run. I think what we all are going to agree on here is that we need to be building these relationships. And it's not just because it feels nice, and it does feel nice. We joked at one point, in fact, about the sort of warm, fuzzy feeling you come away from a nice engagement because you all get on really well. You've got to know people at quite a deep level, and that feels good. But is that real value? And there is real value in that. But I think the real value to decision-making and adaptation and resilience is that all these perspectives bring a new perspective on the problem and on finding solutions. No single discipline, and not even academia itself, can really bring the full perspective on these kind of problems. We need to bring these different perspectives together. And in order to do that, we need to have good relationships, and we need to have trust-based relationships. I think the trust is the really, really key thing. We've tried to write about this in FRACTAL. We've tried to think about a lot is what do we actually mean by trust-based relationships? And one thing that's come out really clearly there is humility. And it's not a word that we hear very often in these kind of spaces, but we need to be quite humble about what we know, what our capabilities are, and what our limitations are. So as a climate scientist, I need to say, I can go this far, this is my expertise, this is what I can say about this context. But this is where I'm at a loss, this is where I can't say anything. And sometimes that's really hard, particularly as we want to demonstrate that we can know everything, you know. That's kind of our metric. So we need to practice this exercise of being humble, and I think that's really key. I think we need to model that as a leadership of a program, and I think there's some really interesting ways of doing that. Okay, I wanted to step onto a little bit of a different topic, which is this question of sustainability. So we talk about building these relationships, and that's all great, and we've done a lot of that in FRACTAL, and we know each other well, and we work well together. But what does it mean when the program ends, which is really what we're talking about today? And it's very easy to fall back into what we call safe spaces. We use that term quite a lot in FRACTAL. Our safe space is where I'm operating within my discipline, and it's a comfortable space. And you find we've even seen it in this last year of FRACTAL, where the kind of intensity has diminished a bit, and you see people starting to retreat back into, it's much easier actually just to operate within my discipline and not be outside of this safe space. So I think how we address that from a sustainability perspective is we need to build a big enough culture of operating outside of our safe spaces and operating within these relational networks. To do that, we need a critical mass. I think that's really, really important. We can't have just 3 or 4 people operating in this kind of modality. We need a critical mass of people. Is one city enough to do that? I'm starting to realize that probably not. So I'm very encouraged by the discussions today around networking particularly across Africa. And in FRACTAL, we've worked across 9 cities, and a lot of the conversation now, and Gilbert could talk well to this, is how do we continue the connections across the cities? So in the program, we did learning exchanges between cities, so people traveled from one city to another to learn about that city context and how they're operating, and came back again. We had mayors doing that. So it's quite a high level, as well as the embedded researchers and students also involved in the program. So what we're really focusing on now is how do we build that network of relationships that has a critical mass to be sustainable, that's not going to fall apart when one person leaves. That's really, really key. The other thing that's really important is demonstrating the value. We need to have enough people who have experienced the value of operating in these kind of trusting relationship mode of engagement, and will become advocates for it. And I think we've achieved that in FRACTAL. I'm always really impressed in FRACTAL when we have an engagement and we don't have to advocate anymore. People that have been involved before say, this is really important. And they explain to the newcomers, this is how it works in FRACTAL and this is why it works. And they become the advocates for the process itself. So I think that's really key. We need to be developing emerging researchers and young practitioners. So in FRACTAL, we worked with embedded researchers, researchers embedded within city councils, but we also worked with a lot of emerging researchers, so young academics, and then working with youth. So really exciting work in Lusaka, working with youth organizations, youth activist organizations. Gilbert's really led that charge, and it's been really, really powerful. So we need to be building up a young cohort, if you like, of people who are able and excited about engaging like this. But at the same time, we need support from the top. So I was very excited this morning. The meeting in Gaborone was opened by the mayor of Gaborone, who clearly was very supportive and very excited about what we're doing in the program. So you need that kind of leadership from the top and that support from the top. And then another key one, which I don't think we've addressed well, and I think this is perhaps where EPIC has a real position to play in this space, is transformation of universities. So I think universities need to be rethinking how they function. Universities are quite isolated into disciplinary silos, and it's difficult to work across different disciplines within university. Gilbert, again, can speak a lot to this. There are a lot of challenges here. So I think for me, that's one of the key challenges that we haven't managed to address well in FRACTAL, and I'd really like to pick up in other programs. So I could say a lot more about relationships, but I think we've gone time, so let's carry on from there.
Thanks so much, Chris. I feel like my job as a moderator is not really necessary because the panelists are feeding into each other, which is wonderful. So Gilbert, you're next. And Chris mentioned your name many times in a number of different ways, but really what I would like you to unpack, and you've been involved in EPIC, you're in the leadership there, you've been very involved in FRACTAL, one of the core leaders, particularly in Lusaka, and you work within a university similarly to Chris. And so the question is, you know, what opportunities lie with programs like EPIC, what opportunities lie with the learnings that we found through FRACTAL for universities themselves to transform in ways in which the research that they conduct is useful to the cities in which they're based, but also even beyond that. So over to you, Gilbert.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to everybody for such elaborate showing, very great ideas and great presentations. Thank you, Chris, and everybody else. Deeply appreciate. I'm enjoying quite a lot. Yeah, I'm quite exposed and quite on the surface in both FRACTAL and EPIC. And my speaking might touch on both, and I'll pick on where Chris ended, and that's my first input. While it is extremely important that we think about how to effectively work in the third space and how to transcend between policy and science, and also get to engage with real rapidly changing communities, we need to also ask critical questions: how prepared universities are, and how departments, how ready departments are to actually begin to think in that direction. It is incredibly difficult, but at the same time promising that working together in the universities, particularly various departments, and I like the quote that Chris mentioned, extreme social scientists, we also say extreme natural scientists, and we need to bridge those gaps and try to work together. In many universities, in a number of them, and I've been to many of them on the continent, we continue to cherish and be comfortable in our own departments and in our own fields. And so FRACTAL was one of the first projects that required me to work outside my comfort space. And that is not easy, but it is the space that we need to be. Again, EPIC requires us to work with three major actors: the university, the community, and the city government. Again, that requires us to step outside our comfort space. And so what we see in both fields, while universities and individual academics continue to find comfort in working in their own space, what EPIC and what FRACTAL presents is an opportunity for us to have one leg outside our comfort space. And this is what I found very transformative. If truly people believe in the change that these initiatives can bring about, there is a real opportunity for us to break the barriers, disciplinary barriers to knowledge production, and also to generate new ways of knowing realities and also begin to act differently. And that opportunity is very clear in both FRACTAL and also EPIC. There is no EPIC program that will qualify as EPIC if it is only one course. It is about several courses coming together, tapping into the resource, technical, intellectual, and equipment itself from the universities, putting courses together and offering these courses to students who are also drawn from various departments, and then working to deliver real learning and real impact for communities. That requires us to step outside what we know best. The second transformation that I see both EPIC and FRACTAL presenting to us is transforming curricula. Rarely do we find universities teaching in a way that emphasizes both policy and practice, emphasizing on how students need to learn the deep science and how they can apply that science, and how they get to be challenged in terms of theory, or how theory gets to be challenged, but what is actually practical and testable on the ground, and how that which we want to do, the practice, gets to be challenged by theory. emphasizing the existence of knowledge production, emphasizing the importance of the interface. That is what you get in the EPIC project. As we teach them how to do the statistics in class, as we teach them how to understand governance dynamics, they will learn the theories of all that. When we get to a real site in the communities under EPIC, when we get to a real site, to a water treatment plant, to understand its failings and its failures, the science that they covered in class tends to be now be seen and be tested to understand the real drivers and real change. That is the policy, and that is the practice and the theory interface. That type of teaching is not very common. That type of teaching is not very common. And that is what this EPIC presents. And that's the nuance that EPIC presents. And when we train like that, what we tend to see and what promises to come out is a graduate who is confident, a graduate who is engaged with social issues of life, a graduate who is prepared to build partnerships and lead. And this is what EPIC does, because EPIC is about partnerships, just as FRACTAL is about partnerships based on trust and understood in a way that Chris just presented. And those are the graduates that we expect to see. And when we see the dynamics of the world today, from the micro scale to the global scale, it is those graduates that will make a difference, becoming more employable, becoming more relevant to society. And that's what EPIC presents to the program. So as we make our programs, our initiatives, we expect to get graduates beyond, impact beyond graduation day. Then again, what we see in terms of how both EPIC and FRACTAL present long-lasting transformation for universities is the idea of teaching on real-life projects. Usually we like it, and lecturers like it so much, to project that which they know to the learners with a lot of authority. But we forget that which we impart to the learners needs to be tested, so that when the graduates get out of our classroom, they are relevant, they understand the political economy of our cities and the political economy of society. Because understanding the political economy of society is what will make them successful and is what will make them impactful when they get their first job. So EPIC promises, and it has delivered, that when a graduate gets out of such a program, they don't need orientation. They'll hit the road running and they'll make things happen. That is what EPIC promises. And to me, that is extremely transformative, because we have numerous graduates from Lagos to Johannesburg to Dar es Salaam, anywhere you mention, numerous graduates who are completely off reality and difficult to get employed. That speaks to the failing of the university. How did we train these people? We have numerous problems on the continent, and we need alternative thinking that can fix these problems. Those problems are an opportunity for graduates to get employed, whichever way we define employment. And that's what EPIC promises to deliver, and that's what it delivers. The other point I want to draw on is addressing the very long question of the relevance of universities to community. Universities exist in communities, some of them next to slums, very terrible spaces to be in. And the relationship between the neighboring community and the university is almost zero in many cases. But what EPIC presents and promises to deliver is making universities more connected, more engaged with what actually happens. And that raises the profile of the university that makes all of us a little conscious about what is happening next to us. It creates an opportunity for us to understand who the neighbor is and what we need to do to make the situation better for everybody. If we talk of climate change, particularly, for example, the University of Zambia next to two very big informal settlements where flooding is an order of the day. But we seem to be quite divorced from there. And we teach engineering of all sorts. We teach planning of all sorts. We teach governance of all sorts. And the challenge is just next door. And for many years, we are blind to that. What EPIC does is to open the eyes and open the doors that, look, This is a challenge that you need to sort. As you learn, this is a site that you need to engage with. And as you do that, the investor gets to be seen, gets to be relevant, and in many cases, gets to be praised. A thing that top managers need. A point that Chris mentioned, that the one who opened the session today was the mayor of the mayor. And the mayor wants to see praises that his institute is working, just as the vice chancellor of my university will feel very good to receive a praise, even a coverage in the press, that this is what we are doing in our project. And EPIC presents basically that kind of an opportunity, because we look at real challenges in society and we get to help solve those problems. We may not solve all the problems, and we don't promise to solve all the problems, but we contribute to the betterment of those communities, and we become a little more visible and a little more present and a little more relevant, if I may say. So what we if I may summarize what I've just said, is that what EPIC and FRACTAL presents is, challenging us to question the way of knowing. How have we known and documented facts and reality? And for what purpose have we done this? That's what these initiatives present, and moves on to ask questions of sustainability. That this is an alternative way of knowing, and this knowing needs to be embedded in the systems that goes beyond a single funding. EPIC has issues of financial sustainability embedded in its design, because both the city, the community, and the university have a skin in the game, just as FRACTAL was designed in such a way. So ongoing initiatives, ongoing and sustainability of these initiatives is the hallmark of what we do. We question the way of knowing, we question the way of communicating the knowledge that we generate, and we embed sustainability, financial sustainability, and institutional sustainability in these initiatives. I hand over back to Megan. Thank you so much. This is what I had prepared to share. Appreciate.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. So wise, or I feel almost like a thesis in that input. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do, because I'm conscious of time, is we've received what I think is a really interesting question from one of our participants, and I'm going to pose it to the panel and see, just by a raise of hand, who would like to provide some inputs based on this particular question. We can perhaps take a few. I think you could cover a lot of different points. So the question is this: the topic of the session is about continuing the learning. Critical things coming from all the panelists are things like relationships, partnerships, and capacity building. But how do you monitor this? How can you account for long-term change when these softer things, like we've been discussing, relationships, trust, are complex to documents? So who wants to give a go at this particular question about how do we actually monitor these changes that projects and programs like EPIC and FRACTAL engender? Just by show of hands, who wants to give it a go? Mzime, awesome. We'll kick off with you and then see if others have some thoughts. Over to you.
I'll attempt to answer that. But I think one of the important things that we saw in FRACTAL is the ability to have a local agenda setting when it comes to things like impact, for example. So while most funders want to look at hard facts and quantitative evidence, I think, and Chris can also add in here, what we were able to do with FRACTAL was to begin to look at these softer metrics and begin to kind of have a pushback towards our funders to say, look, these are things that might not be quantifiable. We might not be able to have to measure change in a quantifiable manner, but there is evidence emerging to show such very important impact and outcomes, such as building relationships and trust. And those are very important when it comes to the sustainability aspect, because in as much as we can have numbers, graduates, as Gilbert was saying, what are their effectiveness really? And And post-project, post-programs, post-degrees, you know, would that effort still be sustained? So I think, like Chris was saying, there's need for us to build a critical mass around these softer impacts, and also to see how we can build some sort of metric around that. And I think also the issue of having the transdisciplinarity, you know, I'm sure if we had a social scientist here, they would be able to explain how you can maybe measure that qualitatively. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks so much, Mzime. Does any of the other panelists have some thoughts on this, how we can monitor these softer aspects of our programs? Looking around, it doesn't seem like it. And I think Chris has dropped off. But maybe we can just pick up perhaps then on one of the questions that came to my mind, Liz, when you were presenting in terms of the work that's being done by your particular organization. I mean, adaptation, finance, and implementation is essential. Maybe some just deeper reflections in terms of how you've been able to unlock that finance, which is notoriously difficult. And then, you know, we'd love, our audience is often a lot of cities, you know, daring cities, ICLEI congresses, ICLEI as a city network. City officials are also desperate to understand how they can access this finance where the rubber hits the road, which is at the city scale. You know, we're doing a lot of work in the finance space, and you know, we need to provide them with the tools and the methods in which they can access this finance. So perhaps some reflections from you, Liz, on these 2 things.
Sure, thanks. Those are great questions. And also the previous one was too. I didn't mean to skip it over. I'm a social scientist by background, and so I love relationships and those discussions of ethics and connections. And so I find it harder sometimes to deal with the physical scientists, because we come from different worlds. But I feel like my answer would take 20 minutes alone to discuss that. But one thing that we do try to do more and more in our projects is to measure knowledge as much as possible, knowledge learned, knowledge gained, and capacity built. And that is hard to do, absolutely. But we're doing more and more of trying to understand who exactly is learning what and what they've retained after the, you know, what they knew before the training, what they gained during it, what happened afterwards, and then what happened a year later or 2 or 3 years later. I think we're thinking more and more along those lines of trying to measure that real impact. As to those 2 questions you've raised, they're excellent questions. I think for a very, very long time, climate financing was, and still is in many ways, heavily skewed towards the mitigation side. There were a lot of people for many, many years that felt that if we put efforts and money into adaptation, it's almost admitting that we've failed in the climate change battle. And I think certainly in the last few years, there's been a real awareness, first of all, that we're already feeling the impacts of climate change, and so we urgently need to act. I think another thing that's changed is that we're seeing those impacts in places we haven't before. And so, not to sound too cynical, but when Sweden is on fire, and when Australia is on fire, and when California is on fire, then suddenly, you know, those who are donors take note in a way where you realize that just the issues are coming very, very close to where you are. And so there was an acknowledgement in the last few years that really there has not been enough funding going towards adaptation. And so really there's been a concerted push by the global vertical funds to change that. And we've seen from the Green Climate Fund in the last few years, they've made a concerted effort to almost grant more adaptation funding than mitigation funding. And so we're certainly benefiting from that. Another thing that's helpful is that in the climate change process, in the official process of climate change negotiations, we're coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which is in December. And there are a number of deadlines. 2020 was supposed to be, is still, but was a big year for getting national development, nationally determined contributions into place, and also national adaptation plans. And so this push from the UN system and from, you know, this certainly from the Climate Change Secretariat to have countries have those plans in place has really pushed also the funding for organizations, and not just UNEP, but many, many others, to help countries make things like adaptation plans. And so it's through these kinds of official processes that are commitments of countries that they are, when a country signs a UN accord or the SDGs or a commitment like that, it is a commitment that the country is committed to doing no matter who is president next year or in 5 years or 10 years, right? It is something that country needs to deliver on. And so tapping into those official processes is something that cities can do, and we see it all over the world. When you can contribute to a national commitment like the SDGs, like Paris, agreement, like National Adaptation Plan or NDC, then I think you're really going to be in good shape, not only to be part of that national conversation, but also to have access to funding. And a lot of the projects that we do are precisely in order to get those kinds of plans into place and to convene all of the relevant stakeholders at all sorts of levels to do so. And so if I can just very, very quickly say, one lesson for us on sustainability is as many of you are also saying in this webinar, is to not have it connected to individuals or personalities. As much as I love all the people that I've met and know through these projects, and these are really important, but we as an organization make an agreement or a commitment with a country, right? Or with a ministry or with another organization, and whoever is there at the organization needs to feel committed to making that happen in the long run, right? So I think this importance of institutional relationships and those commitments that are almost set in stone, that is an extremely important part of the process that we work in. And so connecting to that, I think, really helps in the sustainability issue. I think I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Liz. I'm going to hand over to Tony, and then we'll close off the webinar. Tony?
I wanted to take a different slant on that and contextualize it to the EPIC model, if I could. The EPIC model and the way that the partnership works is that there are funds that typically flow from the city at some level to the university, but it's not so much payment for service, but rather the cost of managing the EPIC enterprise within a university. Think of having 5 classes running in one semester, or 15 classes, and you've got 20 faculty involved, and you've got 3 projects from the city that you're working on simultaneously. In essence, you need a traffic cop within the university to coordinate all of those classes, those faculty, those activities. So the funds that do come in from cities typically go to the traffic cop or the program manager that manages the enterprise, the EPIC projects and the EPIC programs within a university. So in the end, though, to come full circle on this, I think in large part what EPIC projects and EPIC programs do is they sharpen the city's thinking, community's thinking about how to approach a problem. In other words, city could say, or community could say, we want to redesign the downtown area because we want to make it greener. We want to make it more passenger friendly, a more diverse array of transportation. Well, an EPIC program or project could come up with several options, several ideas of how to do that. City could then go through that, and out of that array, maybe select 1 or 2 of those, and then say to a consultancy, we want to do this. We've been thinking about this. We've had some help from the university. We've honed in our thoughts on this. We want to do this. So now you've got the university working hand in hand with a consultancy, and they've done a lot of the legwork, a lot of the upfront thinking that the consultancy doesn't have to do anymore because students have weighed in. So, and therefore it reduces the cost to the city of whatever activity that is. In other words, you haven't hired the consultancy to provide an array of options, but rather at that point, at the right time in time, the city approaches or puts out a feeler for consultancies, and you've honed in on something you want. You kind of know already, and you don't have to go through this vetting again at a pretty high price. So it has benefits in that way too. That relates, I think, to your question, your original question, Megan. So I wanted to throw that in there. Correct me, Gilbert, if I've misstated that.
You've said it so well, and I would just zero in with a small example in a minute. Right now, because of the good history of working together with the city under this arrangement, the city is now asking us to work with students and develop a vetting criteria to vet the consultant's design work to protect groundwater resources at a particular site. And that's the work that is going on right now. So that's exactly what you've said. And that continues, it's been ongoing for some time, just getting into new phases. But to vet a consultant, the faculty and the students are going to sit and heavily critique or engage with the consultant, with the community to sharpen the outcome. So that's just to extend the point that Sean you've just made.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Great, so we've hit our mark of 6:15 South African time. I think it's 5:15 or 7, who knows, Central European time, and I don't even want to ask Tony what time it is in the US. We're going to close the webinar now. We want to thank so much all of the different panelists that have been with us today. All of your insights were extremely interesting, and not only has it been a benefit to the attendees in the session live, but this will also be recorded and broadcast via the very many ICLEI platforms. So thank you so much for your time, and please share the recording with your networks. We wanted to just close in saying that we will be taking these conversations forward, both of this session, but also of the broader conversations within Daring Cities as part of our ICLEI Africa Local Climate Solutions for Africa Congress. It's starting on Tuesday next week. It's soon now, and its focuses on finance for change, which links very much to a lot of the points that all the panelists made, in particular, Liz, your points about the importance of finance. And the focus will be on how this finance can be unlocked for cities. So please, attendees and panelists, to go and register for the event. It stands to be one of our best yet. We've got some amazing speakers, particularly in the opening plenary, secured. And as said, it will focus on finance, and particularly linked to this session today, has a strong subtract on research and innovation, which is absolutely vital in dealing with the climate change challenges that we face. So with that, I'd like to thank the panelists, thank the attendees, and close the webinar for this afternoon. Goodbye.